January 12, 1988. Howard Stern opens an envelope at his radio desk and finds a photo of his house with 4 words written in red. Stop talking or else. What he does in the next 6 hours will either make him a legend or get him killed. He picks up the microphone, holds up the photo to his crew, and says 5 words that change everything. They think they can scare me. Then he goes live to 5 million listeners and declares war on the New York Mafia. But to understand why the mob sent that photo, you need to know what Howard had been doing for months. Since late 1987, Howard had been relentlessly mocking John Gotti on air. Not just jokes. Detailed, specific attacks on the Gambino crime family boss who ruled New York's underworld. John Gotti was untouchable. The dapper Don who wore $1,000 suits and walked out of every courtroom a free man. The FBI couldn't touch him. Witnesses disappeared. Juries got intimidated. Nobody messed with John Gotti. Nobody except Howard Stern. Howard started calling him Johnny Boy on air. He'd do impressions of Gotti's voice, make fun of his slicked back hair, question his intelligence. He talked about the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy where Gotti held court. He named associates by their street names and made them sound like idiots. Fat Tony, Sammy the Bull, Joe Piney. Howard would spend entire segments laughing at these men who'd killed people for far less. His crew thought he was insane. Robin Quivers would say, "Howard, these are dangerous people." Fred Norris wouldn't even participate in the bits. But Howard kept pushing. Every morning, more Gotti material. More mob jokes. More disrespect. And then things started happening. Small things at first. The K-Rock receptionist got a call from someone with a thick New York accent asking what time Howard arrived at work. A producer's car got keyed in the parking garage. Someone followed Robin home from the station one night. She called Howard terrified, and he told her it was probably nothing, but he knew better. The mob was watching. They were sending messages. Howard's program director Tom Cusano called him into his office. "Howard, you need to stop with the Gotti stuff. People are getting nervous." "What people?" Howard asked. Tom lowered his voice. "People above me. People who don't want problems. You understand what I'm saying?" Howard understood perfectly. The station was scared. Management was getting pressure. But Howard didn't stop. If anything, he got worse. He started taking calls from listeners who claimed to have mob connections. He'd mock them on air, challenge them, dare them to do something. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing Howard Stern lived for. Then came January 12, 1988. The envelope. Howard arrived at the station that morning in the dark. New York City in January is brutal, freezing cold. Streets empty at 5:30 a.m. He walked through the lobby, took the elevator up to the radio floor, and headed to the studio. Gary Delabate was already there setting up. "Morning, Howard." Howard grunted a response and walked to his chair. That's when he saw it. The white envelope sitting on his seat. His name written in thick black marker. Howard picked it up slowly. Gary noticed. "What's that?" Gary asked. Howard didn't answer. He opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph. It was his house. His actual house in Long Island. A clear shot from the street, showing his front door, his windows, his driveway. And across the photo, written in what looked like red marker, but could have been anything, were 4 words. "Stop talking or else." Howard's hands started shaking. Not from fear. From rage. Gary walked over. "Howard, what is it?" Howard held up the photo. Gary's face went white. "Oh my God, we need to call the police." "No," Howard said quietly. His voice was eerily calm. "No police." Gary stared at him. "Howard, this is a death threat. They know where you live. where your family lives. You have to call someone. At 6 a.m., Howard Stern went live. Good morning, everyone. This is Howard Stern, and before we get into the show today, I need to tell you something that happened this morning. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that regular listeners recognized immediately. Something was wrong. When I arrived at the station today, there was an envelope waiting for me on my chair. Inside that envelope was a photograph of my house. My actual house where my wife and children sleep. And written on that photo were the words, "Stop talking or else." The studio went dead silent. Robin was staring at Howard with her mouth open. Fred had his head in his hands. Gary was watching from the hallway, frozen. Now Howard continued, "I know exactly who sent this. I know exactly what they want. They want me to stop talking about John Gotti and his friends. They want me to be scared. They want me to shut up and go away." His voice got louder. Well, here's my response. I'm not stopping. I'm not scared. And I'm definitely not shutting up. The phone lines exploded. Every single line lit up simultaneously. Listeners were calling in shock, in support, in terror for Howard's safety. But Howard wasn't taking calls yet. He had more to say. To whoever sent that photo, let me explain something to you. I have 5 million people listening to me right now. 5 million witnesses. If anything happens to me, if anything happens to my family, everyone will know exactly who did it. You think you're untouchable? You think you can intimidate me? You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Because now this isn't just radio. This is personal. Robin tried to interrupt. Howard, maybe we should think about this. Howard held up his hand. I've thought about it, Robin. I've thought about it very carefully. And here's what I've decided. I'm going to keep doing exactly what I've been doing. I'm going to keep talking about John Gotti. I'm going to keep making fun of the mob. And if they want to stop me, they're going to have to do it in front of millions of people. Because I'm not hiding. I'm not running. And I'm damn sure not shutting up. The calls kept flooding in. Some people thought Howard was a hero. Others thought he'd just signed his own death warrant. But everyone agreed on one thing. They'd never heard anything like this on radio before. This wasn't entertainment. This was a man staring down actual killers and refusing to blink. Howard spent the next hour reading the threats out loud on air, describing the photo in detail, naming names of people he suspected were involved. Robin kept trying to get him to stop. Fred sat in stunned silence. Gary was on the phone with Tom Cusano, who was having a panic attack in his office, but Howard didn't care about any of that. He was operating on pure adrenaline and rage. He took calls from listeners. Some offered support. Some begged him to stop for his family's sake. One caller claimed to be connected and warned Howard that he was making a fatal mistake. Howard laughed at him. "Oh, you're connected? Great. Tell your friends that I'm at K-Rock every morning at 6 a.m. If they want to find me, I'm not hiding." The caller hung up. Robin was nearly in tears. "Howard, please. Think about Allison. Think about your girls." Howard's voice softened for just a moment. "I am thinking about them. Robin, I'm thinking about the fact that I don't want them growing up in a world where bullies win. I don't want them to see their father back down because someone threatened him. I want them to know that you stand up to people who try to scare you. Even if it's dangerous. Even if it costs you. You stand up." The show continued for another 5 hours. It was the most intense broadcast Howard had ever done. No bits, no jokes. Just raw, unfiltered defiance. By the time the show ended at 10 a.m., the story had spread beyond radio. News stations were covering it. Newspapers were calling for interviews. The FBI contacted the station wanting to know details about the threat. And somewhere in New York, in a social club or a restaurant or a back room, Men in expensive suits were discussing what to do about Howard Stern. That night, Howard went home to Long Island. He'd hired private security to watch the house. 2 guys in a car parked on his street 24/7. Allison met him at the door. She'd heard the show. "Howard, what have you done?" she asked quietly. "What I had to do," Howard replied. He looked exhausted. Allison took his hand. "I'm scared." "I know," Howard said. "I am too, but I couldn't let them win. If I'd back down, they'd own me. They'd know they could control me anytime they wanted. This way, at least we're fighting back." Allison didn't agree, but she understood. She knew her husband well enough to know that once he'd made a decision like this, there was no changing his mind. They'd just have to live with the consequences, whatever they were. The next morning, Howard was back on the air. He talked about the security at his house. He talked about the fear in his wife's eyes, and he talked about John Gotti again. He wasn't backing down. Days turned into weeks. The threats continued, but they were different now. Anonymous calls to the station. Strange cars following Howard's security team, but nothing direct. Nothing violent, and slowly something started to become clear. The mob wasn't going to kill Howard Stern, not because they couldn't. They absolutely could. But because Howard had done something brilliant. He'd made his situation so public that any action against him would bring massive attention. Federal attention. Media attention. The kind of attention the mob desperately wanted to avoid. In February 1988, just weeks after the photo incident, Howard got a call at the station. It was from a reporter who covered organized crime. "Howard, I've been hearing things. The word is that there's been a sit-down about you." "A sit-down?" Howard asked. "What does that mean?" "It means the bosses met and decided you're not worth the trouble. You made yourself too visible. Killing you or hurting you would bring heat they don't need. So they're backing off." Howard felt relief wash over him, but he didn't show it. "So I won." The reporter laughed. "I wouldn't put it that way to their faces. But yeah, basically you won. You called their bluff and they blinked." That information never made it on air directly. Howard was smart enough to know that gloating would be dangerous, but his audience noticed the shift. The threats stopped. The strange calls ended. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it ever got for Howard Stern. Years later, in 1992, John Gotti was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The FBI had built a case using wiretaps and surveillance. Gotti died in prison in 2002. Howard never mentioned him again after the conviction. There was no point. The war was over. But the legend of what Howard did in January 1988 lived on. In the radio industry, people still talk about it. The morning Howard Stern got a death threat from the mob and responded by going on air and challenging them to kill him. It was insane. It was reckless. It was pure Howard Stern. In his book Private Parts, Howard wrote about that day. He wrote, "People think I'm fearless because of the things I say on air. But that's not true. I'm terrified most of the time. Terrified of failure. Terrified of being irrelevant. Terrified that one day everyone will realize I'm just a guy from Long Island who got lucky." But that day in January 1988, when I saw that photo of my house, I wasn't scared. I was angry. And anger is a hell of a lot more useful than fear. That anger, that refusal to be controlled, became the defining characteristic of Howard's career. He'd gone to war with the FCC, with the religious right, with politicians, with celebrities. But the mob was different. The mob could actually hurt him. And he stood up to them anyway. In interviews over the years, Howard has downplayed the incident. He'll say it was stupid, that he got lucky, that he wouldn't recommend anyone else do what he did. But you can hear the pride in his voice when he talks about it. The pride of someone who faced down real danger and didn't blink. Robin Quivers tells the story differently. She'll say that Howard was terrified that day that his hands were shaking when he held up that photo, that he was gambling with his life and his family's safety. And she'll say that what Howard did was either the bravest or the dumbest thing she'd ever seen. And she still hasn't decided which. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Howard was scared. He was also angry. And he understood something crucial about bullies, mob or otherwise. They rely on fear. They rely on people backing down. And the moment you refuse to be afraid, the moment you call their bluff publicly and loudly, they lose their power. That's what Howard did. He took a private threat and made it public. He took a moment of fear and turned it into defiance. And he bet his life that the mob wouldn't risk the attention that killing him would bring. It was a calculated risk, but it was still a risk. There's no recording of that morning's show available publicly. K-Rock didn't save the tapes, and Howard's archives don't go back that far. But people who heard it live remember it vividly. They remember the tension in Howard's voice. They remember Robin's fear. They remember the moment when Howard held up that photo and declared war. And they remember thinking, this guy is either the bravest or the craziest person in radio, probably both. The story of Howard Stern versus the mob is a story about power. Not the power that comes from guns or money or fear, but the power that comes from refusing to be silenced. The mob had all the traditional power. They could hurt Howard, his family, his career. But Howard had something they didn't. He had a microphone. He had 5 million listeners. And he had the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even if fighting means risking everything. In the end, that's what made Howard Stern a legend. Not the jokes or the celebrity interviews or the controversies. It was moments like January 12, 1988, when he faced real danger and chose defiance over safety. When he looked at a photo of his house, a photo meant to terrify him into silence, and decided that silence was never an option. Some people said Howard was lucky to survive. Others said he was smart. But the truth is simpler than that. Howard Stern survived because he understood that bullies, even mob bullies, are really just cowards in expensive suits. And when you stand up to a coward, when you refuse to let them control you, when you make their threats public and dare them to follow through, most of the time they'll back down. Not because they're suddenly good people, but because you've made it too expensive, too risky, too public to come after you. That's the genius of what Howard did. He didn't fight the mob with violence or money or lawyers. He fought them with transparency. He took their private intimidation and made it a public spectacle. And in doing so, he won a war that nobody thought he could win. The day the Mafia tried to silence Howard Stern, they learned something that his enemies have been learning ever since. You can't silence someone who refuses to be afraid. You can't control someone who's willing to risk everything for the principle of not backing down. And you definitely can't intimidate someone who'll take your death threat and read it live to 5 million people just to prove a point. That's not bravery. That's not stupidity. That's Howard Stern. And 35 years later, he's still on the air.